Hello, my name is Brittney Fucheck, and I am a Master's of Fine Arts candidate. Before proceeding, I'd like to thank loved ones, friends, colleagues, mentors, family members, and strangers alike for giving me the strength and support to explore this work. I dedicate this all to you. Here, I will be giving my graduate thesis defense presentation. My body of work is centered around the investigation of death and how confronting it is helping me cope with the fear of loss. As a warning, this presentation will not only mention sensitive topics of death and dying, but will also have depictions of them. I will give a moment for those who want to remove themselves from the space if they wish to do so. I'll be introducing earlier works that would help me better understand my relationship with death. I found myself with apprehensions that were becoming barriers in my life because of early experiences with loss through death. The first few significant ones were with relatives, such as my tia Rosita and paternal grandfather. I grew up with pets at a young age, so that I would lose them too. The experience that really surprised me was when my mother had breast cancer. Thankfully, she overcame the diagnosis, but the possibility of losing her stuck with me even after her recovery. I was so stressed about her well-being that I had moments of absolute panic at one point. My anxieties became extremely unhealthy. I felt like I was out of control and I couldn't do anything about my worries. This realization convinced me to ground myself and ask, am I losing the present by pre-mourning the future? After thinking about how much death affected me, I took a step back and began exploring the process of decay. The subject of the triptych is a deer that was hit and left by a roadside. After 2 weeks of seeing its corpse rot away, I realized it had either been forgotten or overlooked by sanitation. Its decrepit appearance influenced my decisions regarding composition, color, and mark making. The bones, fur, and leaves are rendered crudely, obscuring the clarity of what and where the subject is in the image. I couldn't understand which side of the deer I had been looking at and wanted to imitate this through broad strokes and solid color. The use of quick marks applied in layers constructs a sense of profound disturbance. What I thought might have been a leg could have also been a piece of the neck or a chunk of the animal's back. The confusion I felt while looking at this carcass influenced how I handled the paint. Decay became a way for me to segue into reflections on my feelings of death. It's scientific and clinical. It's emotionally removed, but it's essential. Becoming familiar with what is known of death will later help me acclimate to the unknown. With the paintings at 12 by 12 inches, I had to be physically close to the surface of the painting. It allowed me to spend more time inspecting the animal without being near it. I was very squeamish at first. I could only muster a few minutes with the carcass before taking my photos and leaving. Vultures had violently tossed the body around, tearing open skin and leaving the animal's limbs in unnatural positions. What really pushed me away was the smell. I can't really describe it. It's not like anything I've encountered before. It's horrendous, and once you know what it's like, you can always identify it. The physical hesitation gave me a chance to think about my emotional hesitation about death. My curiosity and sadness for the deer came from my relationship with my mother and her relationship with wildlife. Besides picking up the occasional stray cat, my mother also comes across animals that are freshly hit by cars, but still alive. She picks them up and takes them to the side of the road, staying with them until they pass. What upsets her the most is knowing that people have the capability of hurting a living thing. She's developed a death doula practice in which animals need her assistance and comfort. I can relate to those animals. In Inseparable, I chose the pelt of the axis deer to highlight my fears of suddenly losing her. The spots that are commonly seen in fawns fade away as they grow into adulthood. However, the axis deer carries its spots throughout its lifetime. My attachment to my mother has not left, nor has it gotten smaller, much like these spots. I didn't understand that emotional growth and attachment are nonlinear until this moment. And this was a big moment for me. I recognized that my anxious attachments were not going away. Using scale and symbolic visuals put these thoughts into perspective, allowing me to better understand myself. This was the biggest painting I had made at the time. The figures are larger than life, communicating a sense of importance. It will be some time before I make large-scale work again. However, I will continue to explore the effectiveness of scale, be it small or large. After Inseparable, I will continue to find symbolism in nature and use it within my work to see where I am with my relationship to death, decay, and grief. The first symbol being mushrooms. Yes, mushrooms. Right before I entered my Master of Fine Arts program at the University of Central Florida, the COVID pandemic hit. There was an uptick in needing agency because of the lockdown period, and many people began to find relief outside. Already with the habit of taking walks, I made it a routine to venture out further and understand why I felt so at home in nature. I occasionally encountered mushrooms of varying sizes, colors, and shapes on excursions. Finding the same kind when revisiting a location is a challenge. Many mushrooms only pop up once or twice in the same spot. Their lifespans can range from a few hours to a few days. Because of their ephemeral nature, spotting the same kind again was something I looked forward to. Having had COVID, the anxieties of illness and death post-infection pushed me to reconsider what I took for granted. Most urgently, the way I spent time with loved ones and the opportunities I turned down to be physically close to them. Mushrooms exist in this phase between life and death. Their role in the environment is to break down organic matter, altering the soil chemistry so that new life can grow once again. Fungi are a chance for rebirth. I fell in love with these little fruiting bodies and introduced them into my studio practice. They came in so many shapes and sizes, I started to catalog each one I encountered. Continuing to use gouache and the addition of acrylic paint, I rendered miniature yet vibrant portraits of each mushroom I inspected. Making 15 of these portraits, the series Moments is not a montage of fungi, but rather moments of joy. Knowing these mushrooms have a very short lifespan, I made sure to consider and accentuate every detail I saw. Even the sticks, leaves, rocks, and dirt that surround it. The zoomed in cropping of the image mirrors the way I was looking at these fungi. My cheeks were pressed up against the soil as I was trying to look at the gills and stem of the mushroom. The bright palette reflects my sense of excitement. While studying mushrooms, spore printing became a part of my practice. Like a seed, spores are the reproductive unit of mushrooms. Coming in various colors, they can be used to identify mushroom species. Because of the different uses and interactions with mushrooms, spore printing is vital to differentiate the ones that are edible, inedible, and toxic. The mushroom top is cut away from the fruiting body and completely covered, allowing the spores to gently fall to the surface below. It takes at least a few hours under an airtight seal for a clear spore print to be made. While the most common spore color is white, they can range from green, pink, beige, brown, yellow, purple, and black. While the activity of spore printing is practical and scientific, I saw it as an artistic one. Unfortunately, preserving them is difficult. They brush and flake off. If I spray them with fixatives, they lose their color and texture. After finding out how difficult they are to preserve, I quickly began experimenting with different methods to imitate them and capture their immediacy. I began to draw, paint, and make prints of these spore prints in an attempt to make them tangible. I limited my palette as a way to formally challenge myself. The only colors used in this series were browns, blacks, greens, beiges, and whites. The same ones found in the spore prints I made. In a way, they are a time capsule. The image made is seemingly immediate, yet also a product of time and patience. When drawing them, I found an emanating quality to them, like light bursting out from the mushroom's underside. I render exaggerated rays and auras coming out of these spore print paintings to make them seem ethereal. This period of abstraction taught me how effective motifs can be in changing the appearance of something, especially if that something is a benign mushroom. I wanted to see how others interpreted their interactions with mushrooms. I found The Mushroom at the End of the World by Anna Lowen Singh. Her observations come from a niche mushroom trade in which the matsutake mushroom facilitates the health of certain trees after the area has been decimated by human intervention, which also creates a diverse market of mushroom harvesters. Singh speaks on precarity and how it is a condition of vulnerability with one another. Precarity is found when we meet new people and say goodbye to old ones. It's in our willingness to change. Without these encounters, be it with nature or one another, we cannot move forward. After reading Singh, I received a book about John Cage's relationship with mushrooms and how it influenced his life and career. He was an important American composer who led the avant-garde movement, and his interaction with mushrooms helped him find the philosophy of working with chance through indeterminacy. Indeterminacy is the belief that things can happen by chance. Cage welcomed the arbitrary nature of finding mushrooms into his practice, inspiring him to make music that was unpredictable. Both Cage and Singh are finding meaning in the unexpected. After finishing the paintings, I realized my intentions were evolving. I found myself comfortable for the wrong reasons. I was still detached and analytical. Although informative and fun, approaching death this way felt a bit superficial. The mushrooms remain in my practice, but instead, I will look at other parts of nature to bring me a little further along in my questioning. Retrospectively, it did show me why I'm scared in the first place. There is a lot to love, and in having so much to love, there is a lot to lose. I needed something tangible that I could handle, something closer to death. While seeking and collecting these hard, woody mushrooms, I frequently encountered dead animals on and off the trails I walked. Feeling a sense of melancholy, my assumption is they died alone, in pain, confused. I wanted to do something about their bodies being left behind. I was given the chance to familiarize myself with the animals. I slowly felt more and more comfortable around the blood, feces, and flies that surround their bodies. The smell still isn't pleasant. It's not like I look forward to it. However, understanding that animals and people have a shared experience of living, dying, and decaying helped me feel okay around these things. I thought a lot about my mom when I came across these animals. Even though she stayed with the animals she found, she couldn't change their fate. I wanted to commemorate their current state into something precious and with reverence. Afraid to lose their likeness, I began multiple drawings using the plein air method. Their images were etched into woody mushrooms I collected with only a pocket knife. Instead of a subject, the mushroom had now become a substrate to narrow the gap between my fears and death. I wanted to take my symbolism further and began studying the commonalities found in traditionally religious Christian paintings. I found that animals are commonly used to demonstrate purity, innocence, and piety. Francisco de Zuberon uses the lamb to depict the cruelty inflicted on God's Son, highlighting humanity's inherent evil. Raphael renders light emanating from the body of Christ in the painting Transfiguration. Here, Raphael is representing his physical change into glory in front of three apostles, Peter, James, and John. This is similar to how I view my spore prints. The light that pours out of Christ's body is described in Matthew 17. His appearance changed from the inside out, right before their eyes. Sunlight poured from his face. His clothes were filled with light. Lucio di Buenansegna paints the flight into Egypt, in which Joseph, Mary, and baby Jesus flee from the persecution of King Herod. The use of halos separates them from common figures. Their halos are painted with gold in a decorative pattern. Resembling a sort of medallion, the careful details that surround their faces help convey their importance. I appropriate all of these commonalities. Then the animals that signify purity, the emanating light, and the halos. Although my aim is not a religious one, I do aim to highlight the magnification of reverence when these motifs are paired with the subject. Focusing on reverence and decay through animal subjects, handling their distortion became crucial. I needed the animals to communicate the state of dilapidation while also preserving their grace. I moved away from traditional screen printing methods and began using water-soluble crayons to create my additions through a mesh screen. This method allowed each item to be descriptive of the animal's decomposition. After the first one is made, remnants of the drawing remain and can be modified before being screened onto the paper again. With every transfer, pigment is moved, mixed, and reapplied. In Al Pasto, by the lake and shells, and El Dragón Durmiendo, the image of the animal reference changes. I use the concept of a ghost image to describe the breakdown of organic matter. Decay is a breakdown of a thing's state. What's more, it is a shift that progresses in increments, blurring boundaries. Julia Kristeva writes about the repulsion this blur creates in her book, Powers of Horror, an essay on abjection. Abjection is a moment in which we reject, even retch, at the thought of ourselves as both subject and object all at once. This repulsion typically happens in things that work within our identity to live, such as food, fluids, and body parts, are altered and no longer serve those expectations. It disturbs the false security that we cannot be whittled down to pieces and waste, causing cognitive dissonance and panic. In studying abjection, I better understood my own reactions to the decay I saw. I was able to push through my abjection with the animals in their decay. I could finally sit with their appearances and smells and find something worth making art over. In overcoming this abjection, I made it a point to subvert it for the viewer in my images. Like Kuzozu, the Japanese art of depicting human decomposition, each of my monotypes made with crayon describes how the body changes with each stage of decay. The Japanese Buddhist monks created these images to create aversion towards the female body as the temptation of the flesh is discouraged. El Dragón Durmiendo contains a bloom of spore prints encircling it, similar to the sixth image from The Death of the Noble Lady and the Decay of Her Body, in which small animals feed on her carcass. While the animals in the Kuzozu are meant to disgust the viewer, the spores are meant to be inviting. Here, the abject is being subverted with the use of both the spores and the halo. I want El Dragón Durmiendo to be viewed as something welcoming, not gruesome. As mentioned before, religious associations influence my handling of these spore prints. I appropriated the halo and applied its associations with awe, respect, and otherworldliness to my spore prints at the same time. Combating my own aversions to death and decay gave me the sensitivity to make approachable imagery for someone with the same apprehensions. Something incredible happened early on. My studio mates began participating in my work by finding dead animals and notifying me about their whereabouts. The more people around me knew about my work, the more coordinates, maps, and photos of animals moved aside for me were sent to my phone. Even strangers stepped in to acknowledge them. I considered the idea of precarity and how it applied to me. The only way any of this could happen is if I am vulnerable around others. I must be open enough to get closer to those who wish to get close to me. Whether it was for me or for the animals, I was comforted by the fact that people cared enough to do something, and that these animals were no longer being overlooked. My studio mates went as far as grabbing the small little dried lizards and frogs and leaving them as gifts in my studio. Some people even cushioned them in protective boxes and cups. I found this level of care and consideration very endearing and very special. I kept these animals for artwork as they had become relics of people's efforts and affections. The desiccation in these animals after death evolves and exaggerates their features. In keeping these animals, I could study them a little longer and found crevices, folds, and bumps I never noticed before. I changed my palette again. The colors applied in my charcoal drawings are overtly tied to my intentions of subverting the abject. Kristeva made it a point to emphasize how severed body parts and fluids cause severe reactions of repulsion. So I chose colors that directly represent these things. Standing in for blood, urine, and feces, I used reds, yellows, and browns for these two drawings. I challenged myself to isolate these colors and use them to highlight the textures of the dead animals in and around my studio. The ribbon is inspired by the Chinese mythology of the red thread of fate. Although overtly illustrative, I found that the ribbon still carries the idea of blood as a universal life source, something I fundamentally share with the animals. My eagerness to handle these animals is in part knowing that others are participating. As Singh mentions in her book, there's something to be said about looking around instead of ahead. My interest in the relationship between violence and nature led me to the works of Ana Mendieta. During the early 1960s, the United States secretly transported thousands of children from Cuba to escape the Fidel Castro regime in a program called Operation Pedro Pan. Growing up in Iowa, she began utilizing the surrounding nature to connect herself to her pre-Columbian Cuban heritage, exploring the idea of displacement. In Mendieta's more subjective land artwork, methodical deconstruction can be associated with the shaping of identity through trauma. In my case, the impressions carved into the woody mushrooms I found showcase the coexistence of reverence and brutality in the animals I find. Ana Mendieta explored the ideas of death, dying, violence, femininity, and the relationship she had with nature and her ethnic roots. Unfortunately, Mendieta died under suspicious circumstances in which her husband, Carl Andre, had been accused of pushing her out of their apartment window. Her tragic end only echoes her very relevant concerns. In Mendieta's Silhouette series, she creates impressions of the body against earth. Mendieta used her own body for extended times in soil, snow, and vegetation to explore her relationship with the life cycle. There was a major critique I received when first focusing on the mushrooms. I was told, it's pretty easy to talk about death and decay in an air-conditioned room. After seeing Mendieta's willingness to endure for her work, I now understood what this feedback meant for me. I thought back to the origins of my investigation and how timid I felt towards the dead animals. I thought about my mother and how hard it must have been for her to see the animals she found on the road suffering, yet she stayed with them. I got out of that air-conditioned room and began picking up roadkill. I originally had the intention of using the remains of the animal. I dug holes deep enough to keep predators away and placed the animals in bags to keep the bones intact after the bodies were fully absorbed back into the earth. I was told to document my process for my own records. I considered it, but I felt a little weird about it. The uneasiness made me want to place an offering of some kind on top of the first animal I photographed. I took an orange from the tree of a friend who so graciously allowed me to use her backyard for her work. From that moment, my ceremonial burials were born. During this transition, themes of ritual through my consistent treatment of the animals facilitated a better understanding of Ana Mendieta's Silhouette series. The animals I discover and bury, similar to Mendieta's body cradled into the earth, create forms that emphasize process and mystery. Both works omit the creator and action of how these wholes are made, suggesting something supernatural or spiritual. As her practice allowed her to connect with her Cuban roots, mine are to connect with my mother and how she interacts with animals. The anonymous silhouette of the bag encourages the viewer to further investigate the image. Seeing how Mendieta's compositions resemble tombs or sacred spaces, I create burial images where the subject confronts the viewer by being directly centered. The question I began to ask myself was, how could I highlight my compassion in these images? The many artificial hills in Florida will show us that even garbage is buried. So how could I separate my burials from the landfills we sometimes encounter? So I stopped using trash bags. I studied other cultures and how they bury their dead and found that delicate fabrics were commonly used. I took note of the different fabrics used as ceremonial shrouds and began to introduce them in these rituals. While using the flash option on my camera, I noticed the plastic bags were very reflective and like the overexposure it created. It felt like the transfiguration light rays I had been drawing and painting, so I explored fabrics with a satin weave to keep visual consistency between my 2D works. In Opossum Cradled in Satin, I crafted bags out of shiny, synthetic polyester that could do this. It's still plastic, but their use had more intent and consideration. Because I intended in using their bodies after burial, I left sage and lavender. This is my way of making a transaction with the animal. I felt compelled to make an exchange. This was my way of returning some of their bodily autonomy back, especially after such an abrupt and violent end. Wanting these images to reflect the diversity of animals I found, be it big or small, mammal or reptile, I would switch up their offerings to individualize them. In buried deer, I had to rent a U-Haul to carry a large female deer that had died behind the house of one of my classmates. It seemed that she might have injured herself trying to reach the fruits of a loquat tree that was out of reach because of a fence. I took some fruits from the tree as an offering for her. I initially avoided flowers, though. I didn't want these burials to feel overly apologetic. That is, until I came across the photography of Paul Cardenares. Residing in Arizona, Cardenares photographs roadside funerals that are vibrant, decorative, public, and sentimental. Placing the fabrics and offerings with consideration, he handles the animals with high regard and compassion. What separates Cardenares and I is how we view humanity through these encounters. Many of the locations where Cardenares finds these animals are notorious for the intentional neglect of the ones left there. Where I find mine are seemingly arbitrary, allowing me to have room for forgiveness and empathy for those who hit the animals. Through Cardenares' work, I accepted the idea that flowers can exist as both a gesture of kindness and mourning. For me, the images here where he omits the brutality feel more tender, more respectful of the animal. In my own photography, I make sure that the animals are completely obscured. I leave expository titles as the only description of what is underneath the offerings. Likewise, the titles reveal whether the animal might have been feral or domestic. Names carry a lot of humanity in them. It is how we identify people. Revealing whether an animal was wild or a pet in the titles gave me a way to give context while also ensuring privacy. Documenting my burials made me prefer the idea of indicating a body instead of revealing it. Since I planned on revisiting my animal graves, I had to mark them somehow. This led me to explore how other cultures create a resting place for their dead. Being of Chilean descent, I refer to the traditional artwork belonging to the native Mapuche people, specifically their grave markers called chema mules. These wooden statues stand around 1 to 6 meters tall and represent an individual who has passed. Being grave markers, they are spiritual locomotives that guide the deceased into the afterlife. The anthropomorphic features and scale of a Chema mule amplify a sense of transcendence. The result of researching Chema mules nudged me towards the study of other cultures and how they honor their dead. I learned about sky burials, wrappings out of linen, sarcophaguses, and the construction of pyres. What really caught my attention were the hand-sewn suits from the Chinese Han Dynasty. Artisans painstakingly fabricated these suits for their deceased royalty out of small plaques of jade. The love and craftsmanship in these funeral suits are delicate, exquisite, and masterfully executed. This tradition leaves me in awe. The ranking of the individual is dependent on the wires used to fasten the jade together. Gold for the emperors, silver for their sons and daughters, and copper for the children on the third tier of this family hierarchy. Seeing the constructions of these suits pushed me to work outside of the 2D realm. I began making objects and focused on the symbolism in the materials I used. I held onto the idea of transformation, which is a change into the next natural step. Looking back at the religious imagery I studied, I began making angel-like figures with the bones and mushrooms I collected. In mobile, these figures are meant to transform the bones into something beyond what is naturally expected of them. I exhume the animals after they are completely processed in the earth and wrap them in wire, copper, shells, fungi, human hair, and pine needle. The act of exhuming them is the first step in clarifying their value beyond a thing that simply lives and dies. As I see it, a violation has already taken place. Reassembling the animal was my way of correcting the violence. I saw this as a chance for the animal to be reborn into a form that amasses admiration. Rebirth became an important fuel to the work and materials. The remains are washed, sanitized, and tied together. The largest exporter of copper in the world is Chile, and being of Chilean descent, I felt compelled to use this precious metal. Besides familial ties, copper has medicinal properties. It's antiseptic, antiviral, and antibacterial. It is a metal that heals. The act of twisting this copper and holding the bones and shells close to me was self-soothing. I can't heal the animals that have died, but I can find comfort in the acts of kindness I direct towards them. Eventually, I lost access to the backyard I was using for the burials. I took it as a sign to stop agonizing about whether they were done perfectly. Instead, I prioritized how I could continue doing them at all. My practice transitioned from burials, like the image on the left, to roadside ceremonies, like the image on the right. What once was a private act evolved into a public one. Others can now see these gestures of kindness and perhaps reconsider why someone would go out of their way to do something like this. For clarity's sake, my work aims to recognize these animals that are typically overlooked, not so much the handling of their remains. Doing these ceremonies is a way to show others that someone cares enough to do something about these animals. I think a lot of my mom when picking them up. I remember how upset she was over a goose that had been hit in front of her house on her way home. She didn't even like the animal because it was messy and territorial and would scare the other animals she had been feeding in the neighborhood. Seeing it in its final moments was shocking for her. She couldn't believe someone could be so cruel to a living being. In a way, performing these ceremonies and making these sculptures is a way to comfort her as much as it is to comfort me. The synthetic fabric was eventually switched out for silk. Silk is both strong and soothing, so I found it appropriate to use this fabric to envelop the animals. That said, these animals needed to exist beyond the confines of my phone. I wasn't doing them justice by keeping them to myself, so I printed them back on the same material I used to wrap them. I scaled up their images, making them larger than life. Since the majority of the animals I find are small, making their images as big, if not bigger, than an actual person would make their burial images even more impactful, more human. While continuing to use the remains of the animals, branches and pine needle became foundations for bigger sculptures. After mobile, I built crib with the idea of making a final resting place for the animals I buried. The crude build of the branches tied together with the copper wire and the stiffness of the pine needle prevent this bed from being an actual source of comfort. The true comfort I found is in the process of making these objects. Because of the meticulous construction, I was able to pause and sit with the object. Doing this allowed me to appreciate the small details I found in the wood and metal. The patience I found when making crib gave me permission to be patient with myself and how uncomfortable I still felt towards death. In crib, I reused the shrouds from the ceremonial burials, which reveal the impression of the animal's body. Much like the spore prints that require time and patience, so do the stains in the fabric. Certain hunters have a principle of using every part of the animal as a sign of respect. It's a way to show that the animal had not died in vain. The same goes for the fabric used in my burials. I make sure nothing is discarded. My urge to use natural objects comes from the film Rivers and Tides, a documentary my mom suggested we watch together. It showcases the art practice of Andy Goldsworthy, an English land artist whose use of soil, leaves, ice, wood, pine cones, and other organic things make up the majority of his sculptures and site-specific works. He describes his work in two categories, site and non-site. Site being the works that remain out in nature, and non-site being works that are removed from their original location. It is not the materials that change the category, it is how they are arranged and handled. Seeing works like Slate Hole Wall encouraged me to explore the acts of rearranging natural materials, while also playing with the effectiveness of works at a larger scale. This is when I leaned into the idea of participation. Once I knew the nature of my work helped others to acknowledge the dead animals that commonly surround us, I built an installation that could better demonstrate that act of looking around. In Todo es Hogar, which in English means everything is home, I suspend branches, copper, bones, and other natural materials. Todo es Hogar is an invitation for the viewer to activate the space around them. The types of objects in this installation range from being messy, neat, natural, and processed. Todo es Hogar is meant to both compel and repel the participant to interact with the elements that hang from the branches. On some of these branches, the spores that I once drew and painted have now become physically tangible. I do this by etching pieces of copper, imitating the lines I saw in my initial spore print paintings. I then carve them out by hand, much like the cut and stitched pieces of jade from the burial suits shown prior. There were two ways I could approach the aesthetics of this work, simple or chaotic. This led me to the works of Alexander Calder, Lee Bonteque, and Joseph Beuys. Alexander Calder, the father of the mobile, made minimally designed wire and steel sculptures that are greatly influenced by forms and patterns in nature. In sumac with gong, the even distribution of weight throughout the sculpture creates a crescendo of shapes that stagger up the right-hand side of this sculpture. I applied this approach of weight affecting shape and position in some of the branches in Todo es Hogar. Using weight to balance the position of my branches changed the way I placed my hanging elements in the installation. Depending on how the branches interact with one another, I can create horizontal, vertical, and diagonal lines. This can create areas of harmony or chaos with a negative and positive space. I found my approach in collecting materials similar to Lee Bonteque's studio practice. Living in New York, she found a surplus of metal, wire, and industrial fabric to construct her objects that speak of impending global annihilation during the midst of the Cold War. I try to mirror her scavenging and wandering eye for mundane items. Like Goldsworthy, it is in her application and arranging that makes the material magnificent. Her work isn't pristine. It's messy and a direct reflection of the turmoil she felt around her. My installation is done in a similar manner. The wax that covers the Spanish moss in my installation absolutely consumes the branch it is attached to. Its drippy appearance raises questions on just how haphazard these objects are put together. Since my installation can be arranged indefinitely, I felt the need to echo the changing nature of physical space, similar to Joseph Beuys. Joseph Beuys's 7,000 Eichen, which is German for 7,000 oaks. Having almost died in an airplane crash as a Luftwaffe during World War II, his intimacy with death led him down a path of reconciliation with his own humanity and the surrounding wildlife. The basalts, seen here as body and grave markers, erode with the rain. Simultaneously, the rain encourages the growth of the tree that accompanies it, making this installation ever-changing. Todo es hogar adjusts to the space it resides in. Whether the space calls for more or less branches, my installation shrinks and grows much like 7,000 Eichen. Making Todo es hogar, with how big and messy it is, gave me some time to think of the scariest artwork I've accomplished, the painting of my mother and me. I specifically made this painting large and with frantic marks because I felt that my emotions and fears were unavoidable and inescapable. This painting would have been different if I had made it smaller and neater. It would have felt less vulnerable, less urgent. Despite my mom being a single mother for most of my childhood, an immigrant who came to this country by herself, and having dealt with breast cancer, my mom is full of life. She's silly, beautiful, and eager to make any moment memorable. Her love and commitment to my brother and me are motivators in celebrating who she is. I want to honor her love for her family and the animals she cares about. Not only do I want to celebrate her while she's here, I also want to have the capacity to celebrate her in her absence. One of the things my mother always told me was that if I found an opossum, I need to check their pouch. I had the opportunity to do this on a trip I took towards the west side of Florida. On my drive there, I spotted one on the shoulder of a highway. I noticed two joeys hanging out from the pouch. They were bruised and still attached by the teat. Another car pulls over and the people contact a friend who rehabs animals. Sorry, the rehabber said. They're too young to save, but just pull the mom and her joeys off from the side of the road. The mother will release a toxin in her milk. They will go to sleep soon. It takes 2 hours for this toxin to release. This information is so alarming, so sad, and so unexpectedly sweet. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I had interacted with opossums before, but this one was different. It felt much more significant. It needed to be bigger than any work I'd done before with animals. It needed to be as big as the impression it left on me. The mother opossum's evolutionary instinct to take the joeys with her left me wondering about my own fate, innate care, and how these animals are really surrogates for the people around me. I saw myself in these babies and how I used to feel when I first made Inseparable. If they're not ready to live separately from her, they'll die. A part of me still finds difficulty in thinking of eventually being separated from my mom. Commemorating her has given me some reassurance that her life is being extended into a legacy. Seeing the importance of celebrating her now might help me reconcile with losing her later. Unlike the joeys, my mother will not take me with her when she passes. I have the opportunity to continue living after she's gone. I need to hold that reality with gratitude and curiosity so that I can create a life worth living despite hardship. Although I'm still scared, I have found tools in my practice that might help me with the uncertainty ahead. I hope my viewers can find them too. Thank you.